Welcome back to the GSMC Hockey Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. We're going to get right into our fourth segment of the night, talking about how this is the furthest distance between two teams in the Stanley Cup Finals history. Of course, during the original six era, teams weren't that far west, as it was just the Boston, New York, Detroit, Chicago, Toronto, and Montreal. All of those teams, besides Chicago is the only team of those original six that aren't in Eastern time zone. So not a lot of travel in the original six era. That opened up the door to big travel when you got into expansion. During the pre-original six era, Victoria versus Montreal was the longest distance. They played in 1924, 1925, and 1925-1926 seasons in the Stanley Cup Finals, but that goes before the original six era, so we don't really count it in the NHL conversations and records. But when it went into expansion, we saw the Vancouver Canucks become a team, and that's when we opened the door to very, very far teams playing very much or a lot of travel during the Stanley Cup Finals. And in those series, it was the New York Islanders versus the Vancouver Canucks in 81 and 82, and the New York Rangers versus the Vancouver Canucks in 93 and 94. The Islanders won that series against the Canucks, and the Rangers won that series against the Canucks. The Canucks suck in the Stanley Cup Final. And in the furthest ever Stanley Cup Final, before the Oilers-Panthers, it was the Canucks versus the Bruins. The Canucks lost that one again. But a lot of travel this year and a lot of travel in that 2010-2011 series. I took a look into that 2011 or 2010-2011 series and saw what I could take away from that. The home team won every game besides Game 7, where the Vancouver Canucks fell to the Boston Bruins in that Game 7. Boston Bruins won the 2011 Cup. We know this. And it was a huge thing in Vancouver that they lost another Stanley Cup, being so close, losing it once again. That the Cup has always eluded the Vancouver Canucks, who have always had a pretty good team, never been able to win the big one, though. For the Vancouver Canucks, they make up three names of this list, and then Los Angeles is basically the other one. You have the second, or the third largest distance between two teams was the Canadiens versus the Kings, 1992-1993. That was the last time a Canadian team won the Stanley Cup. That was Montreal that won that cup against the Los Angeles Kings. 2013-2014, that was a very far one. New York Rangers to the Los Angeles Kings. If you ever wanted the distance between New York and Los Angeles, it is 2,447 miles. Fun fact. And then the New Jersey Devils versus the Los Angeles Kings. That was 2011-2012. A lot of this, luckily for the teams of the 80s and 90s, a lot of these far matchups are in the 2010s, where travel is a lot better in the NHL. Imagine doing this when they're riding their buses in the 60s or 70s, or their horrid planes that they had in the late 90s or in the 90s with the revolution of hockey with the high scoring. So that would be awful. A lot of these series, besides the 92-93 series between the Canadiens and the Kings, were really in the 21st century. But the the Canucks really get screwed out by being they're the furthest West Coast team, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure they're the furthest Western team. That's tough for them. I know they're the westernmost point that you can really get in Canada while still being in habitable land. So for the Vancouver Canucks, it is very unfortunate for them. But somehow this is kind of why I want to talk about this. This is the main point of this conversation. How is Edmonton, Florida further than Vancouver, Boston? I guess, you're considering North and South, of course, in this. But I still, Edmonton, of course, and Alberta, Canada is the second most western province, but still, it's not as far as BC is, British Columbia. For those of you that don't know, that is the furthest west province. That is the province that Vancouver is inside of. It is just west of Alberta. But the Oilers are very far north. I think they're the northernmost NHL team, if I'm not mistaken. I believe they're more northern than the Winnipeg Jets. But for the Edmonton Oilers, playing against the Florida Panthers, it's more about that north and south trip. The Florida Panthers in Sunrise, Florida, pretty much Miami, Florida, very, very far south. And, of course, very, very far east. So there are a total of 2,541 miles between the two teams, making that the furthest distance traveled for a Stanley Cup between two teams. Luckily, for this cup, there are built-in travel days in between each time the teams have to travel. It's going to be 2 days instead of the 1 day break in between games. So that'll help out these teams a lot. It'll give me more to talk about as well, so I do appreciate that. But that does build into the schedule being a little bit cramped. That is why that we only have a couple of days instead of a week between the Stanley Cup final and the NHL draft. Once again, great for me. More content to talk about. I don't know what I'm going to be talking about the draft picks, though. I want to give you guys my top 10, or I want to give probably a first round mock draft in one of these episodes. But, I mean, I have to talk about the Stanley Cup final. That's what's in front of me. So, because of these travel days, you push back the Stanley Cup final pretty much as you possibly can. And then you push it right to the edge of the NHL draft. So, it'll be very difficult for these teams, of course. They're traveling. It is about a 5.5 to 6 hour flight between the two destinations. Also taking into account the time difference, I believe Edmonton is in. They're either in Mountain Time or in Pacific Time. I don't know. I actually am intrigued because now you're thinking when you're going to Florida from Edmonton. I gotta figure this out now. They're in Mountain Time Zone. Okay, so it's not as horrible because if you're going from Pacific Time Zone to Edmonton, or Pacific Time Zone to all the way to Eastern, that would suck. But you're going from Mountain Time Zone, which is 2 hours, 2 hours behind. Yeah, I'm trying to think. 2 hours, yes, behind Eastern Time Zone. So when you're going from Edmonton to Florida, let's say you leave at 9 in the morning during a travel day. Leave at 9 in the morning from Edmonton. That is already about a 6 hour flight, non-stop flight if you get it non-stop. So from 6 hours, that takes you to 3 with the 2 hour time difference. It's 5 o'clock in Florida. Pretty much you're losing 8 hours on that plane ride. So that's gonna suck for these guys going from Edmonton back to Florida if there were to be a Game 5 and for a Game 7. That would take a little bit to get used to for these guys, but that's why they're professionals. That's why they get paid the big bucks. They're used to jet lag. Of course, they travel so much during the regular season. The divisions try to manage that as much as possible, but for these teams, they're used to this travel. It's gonna be interesting to see who gets the advantage from this. I would imagine it would have to be the Edmonton Oilers would get the advantage from this. They probably travel one of the most out of any of these teams, being such a northern and such a western team. Imagine just playing in your own division. You're going across the time zone for 5 out of 8 of those teams. I think Arizona is in Mountain Time, or Utah now. Utah is in Mountain Time. I know that for a fact. So get me to be right, but Edmonton probably is used to this. The Florida Panthers, however, are going in the Atlantic. I don't think there's a single team in the Atlantic off the top of my head that would be in Central Time Zone. So when you're playing a division game, they're staying in the same time zone no matter what. And then, is there a team in the Eastern Conference that's outside of Eastern Time Zone? In the Central Time Zone, I know Chicago is, but they're in the West. I live in Chicago. That's the only reason I know that one. So the switching time zones and travel is very difficult. It affects you a lot, especially a 2 or more hour time difference. So it's going to be difficult for these guys. Again, they're the professionals. That's why they get paid the big bucks to do stuff like that. But I couldn't imagine it. 6 hour flight, and you imagine they're going to take that. And at least for the Oilers, they're going to need to take that. Hopefully for them 5 times. So we'll see how that affects these guys. It affected, I really do think it affected the 2011 Stanley Cup final between the Vancouver Canucks and Boston Bruins so much. The home team won every game besides that Game 7. The Bruins were able to break through that and win the series in that Game 7. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. So many storylines in the Stanley Cup Finals. We're covering them all this week on the GSMC Hockey Podcast. So we're going to go through all of them one by one. And our fifth segment, when I get back from our fourth break, we'll be talking about another storyline, the special teams matchup between these two teams.